What's up everyone, Carson Slovak here. Today we're gonna look at a clever little trick to make a Kemper profile out of a pre-recorded tone that you no longer have the amp set up for. For those of you unfamiliar, what the Kemper is it is a digital profiling amp. And what you can do with it that's really cool is if you have a real amp set up with a real cab and a mic on it and you get a tone that you really like, you can set the Kemper up to profile that tone and save it, so you'll always have it, and you can take the amp setup down or move the mic and you'll still always have your tone. This is really useful. I use the Kemper a lot. I've made a lot of my own profiles from real amps that I own, and it is a really great tool for recording, especially if a band is recording and then they take a break and come back like a month later. You're not going to have that amp set up anymore, right? So if you can save the tone that you got at first in the Kemper and just pull it back up and use it, then that takes a lot of the guesswork out of it and it makes everything a lot easier. So needless to say, it's a great tool. The only thing is, traditionally you would need an actual amp, a live amp set up to profile from. So if you have a recording that, say, you made a year ago, and you really like that tone and you want a Kemper profile of it so you can pull it up whenever you want and play through it again, the dilemma is you don't have that amp set up anymore. So this method is kind of a way to trick the Kemper into thinking that it's profiling a live amp, but it's essentially just a way to make the Kemper capture that old pre-recorded tone that you no longer have set up. So I'm going to show you how to do that. What you really need to make this work is both the DI track and the original amp tone on a track. And that's what this is here. Here's the DI, and I'm just going to play it out of the main monitors. Pretty standard DI there. And then I've got my amp track here, which is the original tone that we got from a live amp when we recorded this. This is a couple years old. So assuming this is the tone that I want to create a Kemper profile of, what I'm going to do first, there's several steps to this. What we're going to do is we're going to use an amp sim and EQ matching to approximate the original tone. And then what we're going to do is use that chain to send the Kemper's signal through to profile against. And then the last step is the refining in the Kemper profiling process, where we will pull the switcheroo, and instead of letting it refine against the amp sim with the EQ match, we're going to send it the original track. This is a duplicate of that, so it's the same thing. I'm going to leave this muted for now. And just to go over how this is routed, right now the DI is on its own track. It's going to main monitors, right? So I can monitor it. And then this send 23 and 24 on both these tracks are just so the camera equipment can get the audio signal. These don't have anything to do with the process I'm explaining. So let's solo this up and listen to it. So I've chosen this portion of audio because it's got some palm mutes in it and it's also got some strummy chords. And for the Kemper profiling process, it's good to send it a variety of different tonal characteristics of the guitar that you want to capture. So in this case, I've got some palm mutes and some strums, and that's going to give it a lot of information to profile against as opposed to just one or the other. And I'm going to start with a model of a tube screamer. And I remember that I used a tube screamer and I think a PV, maybe a 6505, to get this tone originally through like a Mesa cab. So I'm going to throw this tube screamer emulation first, and this is about where I had it if I remember correct. And then I'm going to go for this angle amp sim and make sure that the gate is off because the Kemper doesn't play nice with noise gates. And I've basically just, it's going to be a completely different tone from our original amp tone. But I'm basically just going to try to approximate the gain structure here. So let's listen to this DI with the tube screamer and angle amp emulation on it. Cool, so there's that. And in comparison to the original amp signal that I recorded years ago, here's what that sounds like. Very different. So here's the step that is going to help fool the Kemper into thinking that it's profiling the old tone out of an actual live amp. We're going to use Pro Q3, and Pro Q3 has a really great EQ match feature. Now to do this, you have to feed it reference material, and then it will look at the reference material and compare it against the signal of the track. So this is after these amp sims, so the signal of the track that it's on is this tone, right? But the reference tone that I'm going to send it is this original amp track, and I have this send bus 1. So I'm going to make the key input bus 1. And then I'm going to play it back. Pull up EQ match down here from this, and I'm going to choose external sidechain. So now what it's done is it's analyzed the reference track, which is the original amp recording, and it's made EQ moves to put against the sound of the amp sim, and then basically make it sound almost exactly the same as far as the frequency spectrum goes. And I usually have this knob basically will either round out the curve or make it a lot more detailed. And I will typically, for this application, turn it all the way up and then hit finish. So now what you've got is this EQ match that's going to make this sound like the original amp. So let's just compare the two. So still not quite exact, but a lot closer. This EQ match thing is pretty crucial because it's going to get you, like, I'd say 90% there as far as the tone goes. So now that we have our signal chain figured out with our overdrive, our amp sim, and the EQ match that's making this sound pretty much like the old amp track, I'm going to move these guys up here onto this aux input, and that's just because I'm going to need to send a signal from the Kemper through this chain and back into the return of the Kemper. So you'll see that the input here is the Kemper send, so that's the send from the Kemper, and then the return to the Kemper. And the only reason I'm doing that is because when you input monitor an audio track with these on it, they'll become inactive. So I don't need this bus anymore. I'm going to deactivate it, and I'm actually going to input monitor this track because my Kemper output, the monitor of the Kemper, is my input here. So now we're going to start the actual profiling process. I'm going to go over to the Kemper, and we're going to be on Profiler, and then the return level I have all the way down because it overloads pretty easily, so you have to watch that. And then I'm going to hit Start Profiling. And what this is going to do is it's going to send a bunch of weird alien noises through this chain of my amp sim, and then create a profile in the Kemper based on that, based on the response it gets. So we'll just let it cycle through that and do its thing. And then there's a whole refinement process at the end of this, which is kind of the crucial part. Okay, now that's done profiling. I'm going to mute this aux with the amp sim on it, and I'm going to send this DI track to my reamp box, which is going into the input of the Kemper in the front. So now let's see what the profile sounds like that the Kemper made. So now the last step is to refine the profile. And what that does is the Kemper will listen to an input source that you send it and refine its profile against the tone that you send into it. Now this is the crucial step that makes this method work. Instead of sending it my amp sim tone, I'm going to pull the old switcheroo and I'm going to send it the amp tone, the original amp tone that I recorded years ago. So you'll see that this is just a duplicate of this track, and it's going to the Kemper return, okay? So here we go. Let's play it back and we'll do the refinement process. So what we've done essentially is we've tricked the Kemper into thinking it's profiling a real amp by sending it into the computer and using an amp sim and EQ match to profile against. And then when it goes to do its final step and refine the tone, we've sent it the original amp track to refine against, and that will get it pretty much there. So now here's where we're at with the profile, and then I'll just toggle this input monitor button so that you can hear the original amp track, and then when it's input monitored, you'll hear what the Kemper has profiled. And sometimes you might have to adjust a couple parameters. Like the gain. Usually I'll have to bump the gain a little bit. So you'll see I'm toggling in and out so we can compare the Kemper profile to the original amped track, and it's like pretty darn close. That is the entire thing. And then you just go over to your Kemper and hit store and make a name for the profile, and then you've got it. And you've got something that's very, very close to the original tone that you can now save. Hopefully you've enjoyed this explanation, and hopefully you can make it work for you if you're looking to create Kemper profiles out of old tones that you no longer have a live amp set up for.